My name is Russ Seiler. For those that don't know me, I'll introduce myself and my family a little bit. My wife Priscilla and I and our 4 kids have been going here for 10 years. We have a 6-year-old son named Rowan, a 12-year-old daughter named Bree. My son Joseph is 15 and my daughter April is 17, so we have a very good time of life. We have a kid at the elementary school, the junior high, the high school, and Big Bend. And Priscilla is going to Central to become a school psychologist. So if you want some school tips, we'll be in the lobby after. I've lived in Moses Lake a long time. I've known some of you for up to 30 years. Some of you were in the lobby making fun of me this morning because you heard I had to do this, so thank you for that. John's in Spain. Phil is gone today, and Charlie is up at camp. And so I get the opportunity today to come and speak. And I'm actually really excited to do it. We're doing a series on characters in the Old Testament, and they gave me a list of different characters, and they let me pick. And I picked Joseph. That's one of my favorite stories in the Bible. So really excited to share that today, share some thoughts, and there's some very good news in this story for all of us. I love biographies. I love to read biographies. When you read a book on a topic, a lot of times it's theoretical, but when you read a biography, that happened to someone, and you get to see how they reacted to what happened to them. So I love real stories about real people, particularly sports biography. So we're doing this series all summer on characters in the Old Testament. They're like mini biographies, and last week Phil talked to us about Noah, and I want to kind of tie into what he left us with so that we have a common thread. But he said that what we want to do is, one, believe God, but not just believe that He's there. We trust Him, and then in that we take action. And that's the process that God uses to build our character. So we saw that in Noah last week. We'll see a lot of similar things with Joseph. So this morning I want to talk about a very simple model for the Christian life. We have models that we use in various things at work to help us try to understand the complicated interactions between people, to help us navigate. So examples would be a model of personality where you say introvert or extrovert. And it's not perfect, it doesn't describe anybody perfectly, but it sort of helps us figure out, hey, well, how come this guy never talks to me? Well, he doesn't like talking to anybody. It's not you. Or if you're looking at leadership, there might be a leadership model about, I just heard one recently called Hill's leadership model, where you need to think about the tasks that you have to do. You got to take care of your team, and then you got to think about all the people outside of your team. So it's little boxes to help us think about the complicated things in our life. So this morning, I want to talk about a model that's just 2 parts. On my left would be living like God has a purpose for you, living like there's a purpose. And on the right would be everything else. So on the right, it could be any sort of belief. Maybe I don't believe God even exists, or I think He's there, but He's so far away, He's not really concerned with what we're doing. Or maybe I've made too many mistakes. Maybe I had a purpose, but I've really messed up a lot, and I've wasted a lot of years, so I think I kind of missed the purpose. Could be a number of different things on this side. But I think there's a lot in the Bible about Joseph, but what I want to focus on is that he really was able to stay on this side of things and continue to live with the mindset that God had a purpose for him. And it's something that we can do as well. It's something that we can control. So getting into the story of Joseph, if you grew up in the church and went to Sunday school, it's a very popular story. And typically we're kind of at the 30,000-foot level on Joseph's story. So in Sunday school, you would cut out the little cartoon Joseph, and you would color his coat of many colors and glue him to a stick. And I get a lot of these after church every week. I'm carrying them around. Sometimes I file them. So at the 30,000-foot level, Joseph he's got 11 brothers. He's his dad's favorite kid. His dad gives him this fancy coat. His brothers are upset. He's one of the youngest, and there's all this turmoil because he's the favorite son. They end up, Joseph has a couple of dreams. And in the dreams, the meaning is there are sheaves of grain that bow down to another sheaf of grain. There are stars that bow down to another, I don't know if it's a star or a planet or whatever, but Joseph tells his brothers, you're going to bow down to me later. And this is not helping the situation, and they hate him even more. Even his dad is kind of like, Joseph, easy with the bow down stuff. So the hate is so strong they decide that they're going to kill him. They're shepherds, and they're out doing their shepherd thing. And when Joseph comes to visit, they throw him into this dry well. They're going to leave him for dead. And it so happens that there's a caravan of camels coming. And they decide, instead of killing him, let's sell him as a slave. At least we can get a little bit of money, and we don't have to carry the guilt of killing our brother. So they pull him out of the hole, and they sell him to these traders who take him to Egypt. And long story short, he kind of makes his way up the ranks in Egypt. He's still interpreting dreams, and he ends up interpreting a dream for Pharaoh in which God predicts that there's going to be 7 good years with lots of harvest, and then 7 years of famine. And because Joseph is able to interpret this, and he has a plan for what to do, Pharaoh makes him number 2, right behind Pharaoh. So he's the second most powerful person in the world at the time. The good years come, they save the grain. The bad years come, everybody's able to come to Egypt and get enough food to survive. And it says the famine was so big that it affected pretty much the known world. So through the process, Joseph's family comes to Egypt to get some food. Enough time has gone by that the hate has reduced. You know how time kind of helps with that. They're reunited, and everybody lives happily ever after. And so the message at 30,000 feet is trust God, and it'll work out in the end. It's a fine story. It's a fine message. What I want to do now is kind of go back through the story and look at it a little closer and come down from 30,000 feet and see the ways that Joseph was a very real person like us. And when he was living this story, he didn't know the end. He didn't know the second in command and all of this stuff. He was just a guy living his life, and there were some pretty difficult things that happened. And that's the experience that we have. We don't see the end of our story. We're in situations, and sometimes they last a long time. We've made mistakes. We carry baggage. We have all this stuff. And the same was true for Joseph. But when we do kind of the high level, we don't always think about that. So I want to go back to his parents to start. All right, so we're going to go back to Joseph's dad was Jacob. He had a twin brother named Esau, so this would be Joseph's uncle. And if you remember, these were the guys. Esau was slightly older. He came out, they're twins, but he was born first, and that was a really big deal in the Old Testament because the firstborn kid, firstborn male gets the birthright. So they grow up. Joseph's grandpa, Isaac, is an old man. He's blind. He can barely see, and it's time to bless his oldest son, Esau. Well, Jacob tricked him, and he steals the birthright. So this is Joseph's dad. This is like, thanks, Dad, for the legacy. You remember this is the story where Esau was a really hairy guy, and he puts the goat skins on his arm. You've seen these guys at the aquatic center with the back hair. I mean, I like the confidence, but maybe a swim shirt. But he was very hairy. Jacob puts the goat skin on. Isaac's really old, and he feels the hair, and so he blesses the wrong. Anyway, Esau was so mad, he actually wanted to kill Jacob. So Jacob moves away to another area to live with kind of his mother's side of the family. And when he gets there, he meets Joseph's mother, Rachel, who is very beautiful, and he falls in love at first sight. I remember the first time I saw Priscilla. I was working at Baskin-Robbins. I was 16, and she comes in. She was working there, and she was so beautiful and so friendly, and I couldn't even speak. I was just... She thought something was wrong with me. This is how Jacob was when he saw Rachel. And so he agrees that he'll work for 7 years for her dad, and then he'll earn the right to marry her. 7 years go by. Her dad pulls a switcheroo and slips his oldest daughter, Leah, in. And Jacob wakes up in the morning. It's the wrong woman. He's angry. He agrees to work another 7 years to earn Rachel. So now we have a pretty complicated family situation. One guy married to 2 sisters. I can't even imagine. It's complicated enough, right? Then comes Joseph's brothers. He had 11 brothers and some sisters. But this gets even more complicated as a background. So Leah is able to have children, and she has 4 boys. Rachel is unable to have children. This is a very disappointing thing for her. It was a big deal to be able to produce children. And so Rachel takes her servant and gives her to Jacob, and the servant starts having children. Now Leah stops having children, and she's upset, so she takes her servant and gives her to Jacob. A couple more brothers are born. Then God decides to bless Rachel, and she has Joseph. So now he has 1 dad, 3 stepmoms, 10 older brothers. It's a complicated place to be. What is your family tree? What sort of interesting things are happening on yours with the branches? We all have stuff, right? To some degree. Probably not to the degree that Joseph did. That was, I can't even imagine Thanksgiving at their house, if they had Thanksgiving there. But Jacob kind of makes amends with Esau, and the family moves back to their original home. And then the story picks up with Joseph as a teenager. He's 17 years old, and he's working in the family business of shepherding. And because his mom was Rachel, who is Jacob's first love, Joseph's the favorite. And he is almost the youngest. He has one younger brother. But they've had 17 years of having to live with this Joseph the favorite thing. And as we said in the 30,000-foot story, his brothers didn't like. And then he has these dreams about them bowing down and all of that. So we see the situation where he gets sold into slavery. We tell our kids, honestly, we love you all the same. But it would be really weird if we had Christmas morning and you get Transformer jammies and you get SpongeBob jammies and you get Moana jammies and you get tickets to Disneyland. Thanks, Mom and Dad. It would be really messed up to single out one kid. And so there's a lot of strife in Joseph's life early on. And he's kind of a jerk about it too, and it doesn't help. He has these dreams that he'll be a leader, and he's kind of anticipating what that might look like. Imagine that he's got a picture in his head. Next thing you know, he's off as a slave in a foreign country. He's probably thinking he'll never see his parents again. Probably same with his brothers. He may not mind that because they tried to kill him, but he won't see his parents again. I wonder if you had plans to live in Moses Lake. If you grew up in Moses Lake and you love it, that's great. But maybe you were transplanted here because you got a job with Boeing, or your dad got a job with Boeing and pulled you out of high school when you had 2 years left, and now you're the odd man out in your high school in a foreign place. We all have situations like this that we can identify with a little bit too. Next, we see Joseph as a slave in this guy's house. The guy's name is Potiphar. Again, probably really disappointing. He probably thought maybe he would rise in the ranks of the shepherd world and be a leader. I don't know what he was picturing, but now he's a slave in this guy's house. But again, Joseph was really able to live on this side where he said, God has a purpose for me, even with this big disappointment. And so he applies himself in this role as a slave, and he's actually a good administrator. He's a very good manager. And it says that God blessed the things that he did. And the guy that owns the house starts to give him more and more responsibility. Eventually, he's running the whole operation, and Potiphar just goes into cruise control because Joseph is such an effective manager. And as we know, this is the next major disappointment for him. Potiphar's wife is attracted to Joseph, and she's making all these advances, and she's getting more aggressive, to the point that one day he has to flee the house, and she's holding onto his coat and tears it, and then she's upset, starts screaming, says that he tried to do something inappropriate. Potiphar finds out about it. Joseph's now in prison. So he's a Hebrew, which the Egyptians look down on. He's a slave, he's a prisoner, and he's a shepherd, which the Egyptians look down on. So it's pretty much as low as you can go. Certainly a good excuse for Joseph to move over to this side and say, I don't know about this whole God has a purpose for me thing. But we know that long term, he was able to stay here and be committed to this idea that God does have a plan. I'm guessing that he probably pouted for a while. I don't know. I mean, he was human. But the important thing is that he worked his way back over, and in the prison, he started to apply himself again and do the best that he could. And again, they saw him as an effective manager and started to give him responsibility, and soon he was the second in command for an Egyptian prison. I talked to Dave, who is a member here. He works in the prison system, and I asked him to read this part and kind of comment on that because he would have a unique perspective. And last week I met him in the lobby, and he just said, that poor guy, he just couldn't catch a break. But I said, would you ever see a prisoner get responsibility like this? And he said, no, in a modern prison, you would never see one of the inmates have any sort of command or any sort of supervising duties. You can earn the right to work a job in prison. You can even get paid. I was surprised by that. So you can work a 40-hour-a-week job in prison. And if you do that well, they have work release, which is kind of the peak of what you can do in today's prison. You could leave the prison during the day, work a job, and come back. But he said nobody would ever be given any responsibility over other prisoners. So this is a very unique situation. And I'm sure it would have been unique at that time too. So again, we see Joseph willing to say, I think God has a plan, doing the best that he can where he's at. And then we see God blessing him as a manager. At this point, a couple of prisoners arrive who work directly for Pharaoh. And for whatever reason, they're in the doghouse, and he sent them to prison. Each of these two guys, I think one was the baker and one was the cupbearer, whatever that is. I think that's the guy who tastes the food maybe to see if it's poisoned. Both of these guys have a dream, and Joseph interprets their dreams, and the outcomes happen. One of them is put to death by Pharaoh, and one's restored to his position. Joseph told the guy who was restored, please remember me and put in a good word for me and get me out of this horrible place. So sometimes we have this picture that Joseph is in prison, and he's just like, God has a plan. It's all good. I think he knew that God had a plan, but he was not just happy to be there. He was suffering. It was a miserable place. Anyway, the cupbearer completely forgets about him for 2 more years. So he was 17 when his brothers tried to kill him. And then we're told that after the 2-year period, he's 30 years old. So he was 13 years of being a slave and a prisoner and not knowing the end of the story. Just remember, he didn't know how it was going to work out. For 13 years. If we have something happen to us that lasts for a month, it rocks our world, right? Have you had a bad situation that lasted for a year or 2 or 5 or 13? That's a long time to stay and say, I still think God has a purpose. So Pharaoh has a couple of dreams that are really disturbing. The cupbearer remembers, I can't believe I forgot there's this guy, this Hebrew slave in prison. He knows how to interpret dreams. So Pharaoh calls him up. They give him a shave and a bath and fresh clothes, which I love that detail. You know, you're not just going to bring up this bearded, smelly guy to Pharaoh. So they clean him all up and they bring him in, and Pharaoh tells him the dreams. And Joseph says, I can't interpret your dream, but God can. And he tells Pharaoh that, you know, we'll have the good years and the bad years, and he lays out the plan. And so there are a lot of things we could focus on with Joseph, and there's this whole business of his brothers coming back. But at this point, I just want to talk about his ability to continue to see that God has a purpose for me and to not give in to the temptation to say, maybe it wasn't true. Maybe God doesn't really care, or maybe God's not there, or maybe he's abandoned me. For us, we have a lot of opportunity to let go of this idea that God has a purpose for us. And when we take a little closer look at Joseph, we see he had the same things. What sort of family background do you have? Did you have a really tough time growing up? Did that affect you? Did that make you feel like maybe you weren't one of the ones that was going to make a difference? Have you had some really big disappointments? You know, I think if you live long enough, it's going to happen. A job that you really wanted, a promotion that you wanted, or a child that you hoped to have that weren't able to have. It's hard to see what's going on with that, and it's really easy to say, it didn't turn out like I thought. Maybe I was wrong about this whole purpose thing. What about living in Moses Lake? You know, if you're not from here, if you're from Seattle and you move here, that's like a foreign country. I work for the PUD. We have a Seattle transplant right here. A lot of times they'll hire somebody from Seattle, and they'll bring them over, and then their spouse will see it, and they're gone 6 months later. You know, Moses Lake's not a big metropolis. Do you ever think, I ended up in this little town, maybe I'm just gonna, just live my life. I didn't do the important things I thought I was going to do. What about money? Maybe you thought, I'd have more money by now. And you look at somebody that's got a lot of money and they got brand new vehicles and no worries, and you think, well, sure, maybe God could use them. They don't have any problems. But for me, if the gas goes up by 50 cents, then I got to figure out what I'm going to do, right? It could also be something really positive that happens that pulls us off of this side where we're looking for God's purpose. Joseph got promoted to the second in command of Egypt. He was part of interpreting dreams and predicting the future. He could have let that positive experience kick him off and say, hey, God, thanks for the memories, but I'm number 2 in Egypt now, so I think I got this. So we can get bumped off of this idea that God has a purpose for us in lots of different ways. I had one of the past general managers at the PUD, I was talking to him about the roller coaster that can happen at work when you have a really good experience, but then you have a really bad one. And he had something really insightful, I thought. He said, you can pout for a day or you can celebrate for a day, and then you got to get back to work. When things happen to us, we are human and we will have a reaction. I think Joseph probably had a reaction, but then we got to get back over here and say, what is God's purpose? Whether the thing was really positive or negative, we got to get ourselves back over here. It's kind of like the narrow road and the wide road, in the New Testament. There's very few people who pick the way of life, but there's a lot that take the road to destruction. The narrow road, I was thinking about a balance beam. There was this event in Spokane. We went to the Spokane Fair one year, and they had something called mutton busting. Have you guys seen this? So they take the little kids whose parents are like in the rodeo. I'm talking like 4 years old, 5 years old. And they put a helmet on them, and they have this big long pen, and they put the kid on a sheep, and then they open the chute, and the sheep takes off. And there was this one little kid, I'll never forget him. He's clinging onto the sheep like this, and he starts to rattle over like this. And by the time the sheep made it to the other side, he's hanging underneath the sheep with his little helmet. But he made it all the way. And I kind of think about staying over here. You might kind of slip off the beam, but just hang on to it. Hang on to the idea that God has a purpose for you. That's our part. Another thing that I thought about with the Joseph story is we may think, well, Joseph was a special person. Maybe he was like a really good person. And I'm not. I'm just a normal person. We look at each other and we sort of rank each other based on what we see. So if we were to, I'm going to start doing a little bit of math here, so bear with me. But let's say that we had a scale and we would rate people from 1 to 100 to say how much potential we think they have to produce something valuable. We would look at things like their education, their family background, their gender maybe. We might look at how intelligent they are or how physically attractive they are. And we kind of rank people. And we think, well, maybe Joseph, it says in here he was a good-looking guy. He had a wealthy family. So maybe he's just destined for it. Like Jeff Bezos or Michael Jordan or something, right? Well, if we were to put God on that scale of how much potential God has to make a dent, if we're in the range of 1 to 100, God's potential is infinite. He's all-powerful. And here's the math part. If you add a small number to infinity, what do you get? Infinity. You can't make infinity bigger. So infinity plus 100 is infinity. Infinity plus 1 is infinity. God's method for interacting with the world, for whatever reason, is mostly by working with us. I don't know why exactly. I did hear one man say he was in business with his sons, and he was thinking one day about how much he enjoyed that. And he thought, I wonder if God just likes working with us. But for whatever reason, this is the method that he most commonly uses. God plus whatever we are equals whatever he's trying to do. So remember, when there's infinity on this side, it really doesn't matter what number you are if we had numbers. What matters is that you're willing to show up and you're willing to participate. You're just willing to stand over here. It doesn't matter how much potential we perceive in ourselves or others perceive. So I think about a couple more things from the New Testament. God said, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can tell a mountain to fly into the ocean. That's what, it's infinity plus a mustard seed. Just all you got to do is say, okay, I'll bring the mustard seed, and God will put the power into it. Or the feeding of the 5,000, it's the same message. Some little kid, there's all these hungry people, he has a little bit of food, mix it together with Jesus, and everybody's eating. But the kid had to give him the food, right? You got to be willing to join the party. God doesn't need your talent. He doesn't really care how much money you have. It's not about that. He's looking for a willing heart. And I think that's where Joseph was just willing to keep saying, there's some purpose for me. I came across a medieval quote, which if you're going to write anything down, I would write this down. It says, God can use a crooked stick to draw a straight line. I love that. Definitely a crooked stick. So to wrap this up, I kind of want to go back to what Phil set for us and tie that in just a little bit more with the Joseph story. Phil gave us this idea that we have to believe God, but not just that he's out there. We have to trust him, that he wants to be part of our lives, that he has a purpose. and then we take action. And through that, character forms. So with Joseph, he believes God. He has trust. And what does that mean? There's a boldness that came with that. I think especially about when he had to go to Pharaoh and interpret the dream. He is in a foreign land. They don't believe in his God. Here's a Pharaoh who can have him killed just on a whim. He could have just interpreted the dream, but he takes the time to say, I don't actually have this ability. It's God. There's a boldness to that. And we're experiencing a situation in our culture where being a Christian is not in fashion, and it's getting more and more to where if you're a Christian that people think a lot of negative things about you. So how many times do you go to work on Monday and someone says, how was your weekend? And you think, well, I went to church yesterday, but what you say is, yeah, we went boating, or yeah, we hung out at the house. And you don't even want to say, I mean, I'm talking about myself here. You're not even sure if you're supposed to say, yeah, I went to church. Or maybe there was a sermon that John gave or Phil that really got you thinking. And that's what's on your mind. But the person says, how was your weekend? And you think, well, I'm not supposed to talk about this. So you just talk about the weather or whatever. I would say, let's be a little bolder. Other people talk about what they're thinking and what they're experiencing. You're not having to shove it down somebody's throat. You're just saying what's happening in your life. That's what Joseph, it's like, can you do the dream thing? Well, no, but I have God and he does it. There's a boldness to that. I was at a business conference in Houston. The PED sent me down there, 400 people. And one of the speakers was really dynamic, and everybody was kind of just enamored with them and on the edge of their seat. He was a CEO. And so somebody during the Q&A says, do you have any book recommendations? And we're all ready with their pencil because it's like, if this guy read it, I want to read it too because this guy's amazing. He says, well, you know, I would tell you to read the Bible, but that's not what you're asking, but that's what I read the most. And then he listed 3 or 4 popular kind of business books. But it really struck me. He wasn't telling everybody, you're a sinner, you're going to hell. But he was just saying, if you want to know what I read, that's what I read. And so think about that boldness that comes with believing and trusting. What about the actions that we're meant to take? I remember when I was in college, there's this, maybe high school too, you have these big decisions coming. April's in that spot right now. Where do I go to college? What should my major be? Who should I get married to? Where should I live? And it feels like these huge forks in the road. And I remember thinking, I just wish God would come down, tell me in a dream what to do, or write it on the wall, or, you know, these different stories. I would do the thing where I'd open my Bible and point, you know. But I have found that he doesn't appear to me in dreams. If you've had that experience, tell me about it after because I want to hear it. But we are still not without direction on what action to take. You know, we have the golden rule. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. You can build your whole life just on that. You don't need God to come down and dream and tell you more. Remember, we're his hands and feet. The person that you sit next to at work, you might be the only Jesus that they get to see, or your neighbor. There's a lot of hurting, lonely, confused people out there. We don't normally share that with each other because it's not socially acceptable. But be bold. If you see somebody and you can tell something's wrong, you think, well, should I say something? That'd be awkward. Be bold. Hey, it looks like something's bothering you. Oh, no, it's fine. Well, you know it's not. Well, because, you know, I noticed that you're just sitting there staring at the floor. Like, what's going on? And then you just let them talk. A lot of times people are looking for some support, but it takes that boldness to step over that social kind of barrier of, I don't want to get involved in this person's life. The other thing is, just do the best that you can where you are. Joseph got sold as a slave. He became known as a capable manager. That didn't happen because he was just sitting there. It happened because he applied himself. He was in the situation. It was horrible. But he went ahead and did the best that he could, and God bless that. So wherever you are, you know, do the best that you can and see what God will do with it. We don't necessarily need a step-by-step roadmap, and we're probably not going to get one. And then last thing that Phil said was that this is where character grows. And how does that happen? A lot of times we think we have to kind of fix ourselves and get ourselves ready before we come over and tell God we're ready to be on his program. But we don't need to do that. There is something about trusting that God has a path and doing the best that we can. God works on the character part. So with Joseph, he knew there was going to be a worldwide famine, and he was going to need somebody who could lead the world through that situation. That is not a simple thing to do. People are starving. Their children's lives are at risk. Their livestock are dying. There's going to be a lot of tension in that situation. And you have a lot of different countries that are coming to get grain. So you're going to need somebody to to administer that and manage that who has seen some stuff and has some scars. You know what I'm talking about? That's where character comes from. It's from some of the hard things that we go through. So getting thrown in a well and left for dead, getting sold as a slave, and rising up in that household, and then back to prison. Running an Egyptian prison, that has got to be a tough situation. You got some characters in there that are not really interested in what you had to say. And Joseph did that for 13 years. And so now when he steps in and he's got to direct everybody to save food and then distribute food, this is not his first rodeo. And so he's ready. Our job is just to get over here and do the best that we can and trust that God's working out what needs to happen. Do you have some weird stuff in your background? Well, maybe you're just well suited to help someone else that has weird stuff. You know, I mean, it can all work together. Very last thought here. What is the purpose of God building character in us? It's not just so that we can have character. That's not the end game. With Joseph, his purpose was to save the world. There was going to be this famine that affected the whole world. And if they hadn't saved food, a lot of people would have died. Well, God's purpose is still the same now. He wants to save the world. And we are the ones that are here. Joseph is dead and gone since 2500 BC. But you're here and I'm here. And the point of it all is still to save the world. So what would the world miss if you believe something that says, I don't think God had a purpose for me. I think that time has passed. What will the world miss? But what will the world gain if you say, okay, God, I'm willing to come over here. I just have a little mustard seed, but it's yours if you want it. You know, so will you come back to this side? Will I come back to this side and say, what is it that you want to do, God? Let me just pray for us really quickly, and then we'll turn it over to the worship team. God, we thank you for the examples that you give us. The example of Joseph, one of my favorite stories. We acknowledge that many times we are not looking for your purpose. We're distracted, or we have a lack of self-confidence. But I pray that where that's happening and where you're looking for us to get involved, whether it be a coworker or a family member or a neighbor or a project, would you reveal that to us? And would you help us to have the confidence to take that step and bring the little bit that we have so that we can combine it with the lot that you have, and we can carry out your purpose to be part of saving the world. Amen.